Today is December 27, 2016. We are partway through Hanukkah and have been studying Josephus' account of the Hanukkah event in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, and I think we are in Chapter 6 now. So before we get back into it, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, thank you for helping us to abandon the ways of folly, the ways of falsehood, and to be on the path of wisdom and truth. We know that we still have many misconceptions, at least that seems to be inevitable, and we don't yet know what they are now, but please show us, correct our misunderstandings, and help us to love correction, and to rejoice in truth, and to identify with the truth. So guide us as we continue to study this important aspect of history. Help us to learn all the lessons that we ought to from it, and to be able to move forward with greater understanding and bring into our practical lives the principles of truth and righteousness. Todah, thank you. We ask this b'shem tzemach. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so, and by the way, b'shem tzemach means in the name of branch, branch being the new name of the Messiah according to Zechariah 6, verses 12 and 13, Zechariah 3, and Revelation 3, verse 12, and 2:17, along with other passages. And I know that you guys, most likely everyone on the call understands that, but I think it's good to refresh our memories. So yesterday, or last night, in our discussion and in our reading, we looked at a few paragraphs from Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 6, and the last paragraph that we read was paragraph 2. And it describes a circumstance with Mattathias, Mattathias being the individual who, with his sons, started what later became known as the Maccabean Revolt. And it describes Mattathias, who was a priest, and he was called upon to sacrifice, but again, the sacrifices at this time were those instituted by Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek king at the time, and they were not at all in harmony with the law of Yahweh. And so Mattathias refused. But another person, I believe his name was Apelles, who was the king's general, he compelled them to sacrifice. And someone went to sacrifice. Mattathias, filled with indignation, he and his sons came up and killed the person who sacrificed and Apelles. And they ended up running away into the desert and hiding in caves. And there were other Jews who did the same. And essentially they were hiding away so that they could freely keep their religion. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is that some of them ended up being killed on the Sabbath because they wouldn't fight on the Sabbath. And the Greeks came to realize that, and so they went to destroy them. And Mattathias then, according to this account, gave some sort of speech wherein he convincingly argued that they should fight on the Sabbath if they are attacked. And that's what they ended up doing. And the last thing that we were told here is that Mattathias gathered a great army, and they overthrew the various idol altars that were being set up, and they killed those who were breaking the laws of Yahweh, and they took the children, the boys who had not yet been circumcised, and circumcised them, and that was the general idea. So there's this great reform that is taking place, headed by Mattathias, and that was the beginning of, again, what became known as the Maccabean Revolt. And of course, we discussed this in terms of when is it appropriate to fight? Is it ever appropriate to fight? Is it appropriate to fight on the Sabbath? And, I don't know if all of our questions in regard to these things are answered yet, but I know it was certainly a fruitful discussion, and there may be still more comments. So I wanted to find out if there are any further comments or questions from anyone concerning what we have already gone over, or this history in general, or if you guys are ready to move on to paragraph 3. It doesn't seem like anyone has any comments or questions. So would someone like to volunteer to read paragraph 3?
I'll go ahead and read it. Paragraph 3. But when he had ruled 1 year, let me make sure that. Yes.
Yeah, and he, again, the he here is Mattathias. That's who it was speaking of just before this, and he, ended up basically having this group of people. He gathered an army, and he's leading the people. So, yeah.
But when he had ruled 1 year and was fallen into a distemper, he called for his sons and set them round about him and said, O my sons, I am going the way of all the earth, and I recommend to you my resolution, and beseech you not to be negligent in keeping it, but to be mindful of the desires of him who begat you and brought you up, and to preserve the customs of your country, and to recover your ancient form of government, which is in danger of being overturned, and not to be carried away with those that, either by their own inclination or out of necessity, betray it, but to become such sons as are worthy of me, to be above all force and necessity, and so to dispose your souls as to be ready, when it shall be necessary, to die for your laws, as sensible of this, by just reasoning, that if God see that you are so disposed, he will not overlook you, but will have a great value for your virtue, and will restore to you again what you have lost, and will return to you that freedom in which you shall live quietly and enjoy your own customs. Your bodies are mortal and subject to fate, but they receive a sort of immortality by the remembrance of what actions they have done. And I would have you so in love with this immortality that you may pursue after glory, and that when you have undergone the greatest difficulties, you may not scruple for such things to lose your lives. I exhort you especially to agree one with another, and in what excellency any one of you exceeds another, to yield to him so far, and by that means to reap the advantage of everyone's own virtues. Do you then esteem Simon as your father because he is a man of extraordinary prudence, and be governed by him in what counsels he gives you? I'm going to reread that because that's the way they're writing this. That's not a question. So it's a command. Do you then esteem Simon as your father, because he is a man of extraordinary prudence, and be governed by him in what counsels he gives you? Take Mattathias for the general of your army, because of his courage and strength, for he will avenge your nation, and will bring vengeance on your enemies. Admit among you the righteous and religious, and augment their power.
Very interesting. Any comments or questions?
Well, there you have a dying wish, so to speak, the father to commission his sons to not fear death, to look ahead. They obviously had an understanding of something beyond this life. And
yeah, he at one point here, let's see, there's something that seems to hint at resurrection.
He will restore to you again what you have lost, and will return to you that freedom in which you shall live quietly and enjoy your own customs. Mm-hmm.
Right, restore to you again what you have lost. And just before then, he was talking about, being ready to die for the truth, even. In other words, lose one's life.
So it also sounds like they understand, the resurrected life to be very different from the life we have here now, based on, obviously immortality, and then glorious, that you may pursue after glory.
Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect. And of course, here he is telling them to have Simon as their father. Mm-hmm. He is a man of extraordinary prudence, and to be governed by him in what counsel he gives you. So that's implying that, in a sense, he was to be as a leader to them, but Mattathias was to be the general of the army. He was to, in that sense, be the leader as well. So it's nice how he was exhorting them not to disagree with each other, but to be united and to let the other lead in how the other can.
So according to this, it's not just that Judas Maccabeus took upon himself the role of general of the army, and it's not just that the people wanted him to be, and so he stepped in. His father laid it out that way. He said, here, just like a king bequeathing or whatever, passing on the throne or something. He was bequeathing certain roles to certain people.
Mm-hmm. And this also, I'm just looking at a little bit, the next paragraph, which I'm not going to comment on, but, when I was thinking about it before, as I mentioned on a previous call, thinking that, did he die in battle? Was he killed or something like that? What I was remembering is the circumstance at the altar. That wasn't him dying, that was him killing. And it looks like he actually died in peace. So that's a better way to die, that's for sure. especially for a revolutionary. It's unexpected.
I wonder what they mean by fallen into a distemper.
Yeah, I think it's referring to a physical ailment.
Well, yes, of some sort. But the reason I'm wondering is because there's a condition that puppies can get or dogs can get called distemper. And it's awful. They die from it. They go mad. And so I'm just wondering
if it's a specific condition.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. I don't know. So are there any other comments or questions, or do you guys want to move on to the next paragraph?
I'm happy to move on.
Okay. Would you like to read the next one then?
Sure. When Mattathias had thus discoursed to his sons, and had prayed to God to be their assistant, and to recover to the people their former constitution, he died a little afterward, and was buried at Modin, all the people making great lamentation for him. Whereupon his son Judas took upon him the administration of public affairs in the 146th year, and thus, by the ready assistance of his brethren and of others, Judas cast their enemies out of the country, and put those of their own country to death who had transgressed its laws, and purified the land of all the pollutions that were in it.
So, in the 146th year
of the one guy's reign, right?
Of the kingdom of the Seleucidae.
Right.
Yeah, according to chapter 5, paragraph 3. And so, in terms of BC or BCE, this 146th year is actually 166 BC.
Okay.
Are there any other comments on this paragraph?
None for me.
Okay. I find it interesting again how here they are casting out the enemies and putting to death those of their own nation who transgress the laws of God. This kind of touches on the same sorts of things that we were talking about last night. You know, is there a time for violence? Is there a time for fighting? How does that work? Of course, the way that someone might look at this there's different ways in which people may look at this. Some may say, oh, that's just awful. And so let's reject, what they were doing as awful. Another person might come along and say, well, hey, that's the same sort of thing that the people in the Bible did and were commanded to do by God, and it's in Deuteronomy and in several other passages. And so, basically that makes it okay. But does that make it okay? And go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not saying that this makes it okay or not okay, but I was going to say that also many countries, many nations today kill traitors.
True. Yeah, there are death penalties. So, I just wanted to mention this is anything like that, whether we read it here in Josephus or read it from the books of the Maccabees or we read it in the Protestant Bible, whatever it may be, that is another aspect to discuss. And I wanted just to mention for people to think about it rationally, because this is talking about a death penalty. And that's a pretty serious thing. There's really, once someone is put to death, there's no turning back from that, So I want people, as they contemplate this sort of idea, to be able to think rationally about it, and not to just say, well, that's okay because we read this sort of thing in the Bible, and not to say, that's obviously wrong because it's killing, and killing is always bad, because, of course, there are times where killing is necessary, strangely enough, and unfortunately enough. So keep in mind to think carefully and prayerfully and deeply about things like this, because it's too easy for people to jump to rash conclusions on one side or another because of preference or bias or tradition or what have you. So again, I don't know if there are questions or comments on this paragraph. If there are, please say so. If not, are you guys ready to move to chapter 7?
Sounds good.
Okay. Would anyone like to read the first paragraph of chapter 7? And again, whoever does, if you could read the title for the chapter as well, that would be great.
Well, it doesn't sound like anyone wants to read. I don't care if I read or not. I'm happy to.
Although we want to encourage you guys to be involved.
Yeah.
So it would be great if someone would like to read. So I guess this is one of those meetings with the long silences.
I'll read.
Just a second. Before you read, actually, I seriously just want to say, hey, guys, it's important to be engaged in this. How many discussions do we have that there's a lot of, engaging conversation, and people have comments and questions and are involved, and think about how much better those meetings are,
mm-hmm.
and how kind of like there's this lull if people don't get involved in conversation and asking questions and making comments and reading and all of that sort of thing. And so I would really like to ask for someone else to read, just because it's a good principle to be involved rather than to sit back and not be involved. So please, it's for everyone's benefit to
or maybe you could ask
in it.
If there's some reason why nobody can read.
I can't read because my book is at home and I'm about a mile away, but I'll be there pretty quick. But there's a reason when people can't do it. They either don't have the book or I'm sure everybody's got some reason where they can't do it at the moment.
Well, some might, and maybe some don't. But hey, that's fair to ask. If literally no one on the call right now is able to,
I'll be home in about a mile.
Okay.
I'm just now getting set up to where I can read.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so chapter 7. How Judas overthrew the forces of Apollonius and Saron and killed the generals of their armies themselves, and how when a little while afterwards Lysias and Gorgias were beaten, he went up to Jerusalem and purified the temple. When Apollonius, the general of Samaritan forces, heard this, he took his army and made haste to go against Judas, who met him and joined battle with him and beat him and slew many of his men, and among them Apollonius himself, their general, whose sword being that which he happened to wear, he seized upon and kept for himself. But he wounded more than he slew, and took a great deal of prey from the enemy's camp, and went his way. But when Seron, who was general for the army of Celesyria, heard that many had joined themselves to Judas, and that he had about him an army sufficient for fighting and for making war, he determined to make an expedition against him, as thinking it became him to endeavor to punish those that transgressed the king's injunctions. He then got together an army as large as he was able, and joined to it the renegade and wicked Jews that came against Judas. He came as far as Bethorn, a village in Judea, and there pitched his camp, upon which Judas met him. And when he intended to give him battle, he saw that his soldiers were backward to fight, because their number was small, and because they wanted food, for they were fasting. He encouraged them and said to them that victory and conquest of enemies are not derived from the multitude in armies, but in the exercise of piety towards God, and that they had the plainest instances in their forefathers, who, by their righteousness exerting themselves on behalf of their own laws and their own children, had frequently conquered many 10,000s. For innocence is the strongest army. By this speech he induced his men to condemn the multitude of the enemy and to fall upon Seron, and upon joining battle with him he beat the Syrians, and when their general fell amongst the rest, they all ran with speed, as thinking that to be their best way of escape. So he pursued them unto the plain, and slew about 800 of the enemy, but the rest escaped to the region which lay near to the sea.
Okay. So are there any comments about this paragraph?
Do we have that kind of faith? Do I?
Yeah, that's a good question to ask. So how do we understand the contents of this paragraph? What is it telling us?
Well, it's definitely telling us, that God has already proven that he's with his people, and, if they have faith and righteousness, that they are going to conquer their enemies, and that, we can have faith in that ourselves.
Amen. So it looks like a couple opponents came along to Judas Maccabeus. He had, evidently, in a sense, made a name for himself in that he had been successful in the revolt against the Greeks, and the Samaritans came, and the Celesyrians came, and all tried to defeat Judas Maccabeus and those with them. And it's interesting how it says that, and of course, we've read this before in reading Maccabees, but some of the Jews who had turned away from Judaism also joined the Syrians in coming against Judas Maccabeus and those with him. And evidently, though, there was no success on the part of the enemies of the Maccabees. I always found the speeches of Judas that we have recorded in the books of the Maccabees to be quite powerful speeches. So I was happy to read this again. I like the saying, innocence is the strongest army. Any other comments?
It's just interesting that, all through the Bible and here too, God's people always need a pep speech.
Right. Yeah, it's just simply the case that the people of God need constant encouragement, and we all need constant encouragement. And, I think about this a lot in terms of this whole movement, and I see times when things are so I'll rephrase how I was going to put this. There are times when the potential of this movement is so obvious, and I can see it so clearly, and others can see it to whatever degree. And, of course, those are the times when the devil really tries to discourage people. And we just have to make sure not to be discouraged. And there's a few things on my mind that actually I'll mention in light of this whole idea. Was it earlier today or yesterday? I'm not exactly sure when. I was remembering a dream that Doug had. And some of you, I'm sure, will remember it. In this dream, he was playing baseball, and he was, he comes to the bat and
to the plate.
Yeah, he comes to the. Thanks. I'm not a baseball person. He comes to the plate, and I think that he ended up. I forget if it was 2 times or 3 times or however many times, he didn't hit the ball. And then he ended up hitting a home run. Or maybe he did hit it and it only got to a certain base. But he ended up hitting a home run. And he understood that dream. And I don't know, maybe I'll even be able to pull it up. But he understood it to be different times when he would be going to the general conference and presenting the branch message. And he understood it eventually to be the time when he hit the home run being the 2010 General Conference experience. And I wasn't even thinking of his dream when I first thought of this, again, either earlier today or yesterday or whenever it was. Yesterday, okay, thank you. I wasn't thinking about Doug's dream. I was just thinking about how this movement is in a place of advancing. We are not in a place of retrograding. And I mentioned to Teresa, I was like, the branch movement has been advancing ever since 2010. And when I said that, I just remembered Doug's dream. And I was just contemplating that, and I actually was able to find the dream here. I don't know if I'll end up reading it just because, it might take however long. Let's see, it doesn't look like it's... I'll see if I can see how long it is. Okay, I found it. So it shouldn't be too long. I'll read this dream. So this is something that Doug wrote down, and I have it in a file called Doug's Calling. Okay. He says, there was another incident, so this is partway through his discussion. There was another incident that happened to me in the early 1970s that the Lord used for a number of purposes, both in confirming my calling and in keeping me humble. At that time, I was in the Spirit and had a dream or vision, I know not which. This is what I saw. I saw myself among a very large group of all kinds of people playing a game of baseball. Everybody seemed quite happy and were talking among themselves. It was my turn to bat. So I stepped up and hit the ball. I saw that it was heading for the outfield fence, so I started running the bases. As I was running, I looked again, and the ball was going to go over the fence. But as I looked, I saw some very, very tall trees behind the fence, and it looked like the ball was not only going to go over the fence, but over those giant trees, which it did. As I crossed home plate, I noticed that nobody was responding to the fact that I just hit a home run. They were just having a good time talking among themselves. I thought that it was rather odd that I didn't hear any cheers of "Hooray for our side" or the like. Then it was my turn to bat again. That's right, I was remembering this wrong. I guess he was hitting home runs the whole time. Then it was my turn to bat again. So I hit the ball like the first one and started running the bases. This time I noticed that not only was the ball going over the fence and those tall trees, but that it was going way over those giant trees. Again, as I crossed home plate, nobody was responding to the fact that I just hit a home run. They were still just having a good time and talking among themselves. Again, I thought that was really strange. Then, when my turn to bat came up again, I stepped up and hit the ball again. This time, as I was running the bases, I looked really close at the ball. Okay, this time, as I was running the bases, I looked really closely at the ball. Not only was it going way over the fence and giant trees, but it seemed to have enough velocity without any resistance that it could go all the way around the world. It was most strange. But again, as I crossed home plate, nobody seemed to notice or care about what had just happened. This time, I got rather perplexed and asked God, why wasn't anybody responding or seemingly caring that our team was prospering? Then one young woman in the crowd looked at me and smiled understandingly. This was the end of dream or vision. Years later, I had been publishing what the Lord had showed me on the true nature of the Lord's Supper and passing it out to the Adventists at the 1990 GC session, and thereafter, what I saw in that dream or vision came back to my mind. That is, everybody was quite happy about their fellowshipping together and that they were there in the game. But what I had been doing for the team was going on without a response that I was aware of, except from that smiling young woman. I understood that those tall trees represented the leaders and scholars of the church in general, and what I was teaching on the Lord's Supper was destined to go way over their heads, so to speak, the first time it was presented to them. That first time was in 1990. Because of that dream or vision, I also understood that I was not to expect much, if any, recognition from them for my work, no matter how great that work was, for the people on my team were preoccupied with other things. The situation was the same after I passed out parts 2 and 3 of the Lord's Supper at the GC session in 2005. As parts 2 and 3 contained much more information on the history of the supplanting of the Lord's Supper, especially as it was tied with health reform and daily worship, I could see it went even further over the tall trees that second time I came to bat. But the third time, I came to bat at the 2010 GC session, and the matter was presented from the biblical basis of what Jesus blessed and why, and the true fellowship nature of the suppers of the Lord. I could see there was nothing that could keep it from going all around the world, like the ball I hit the third time in the dream or vision. In that dream or vision, I was running the bases, and I saw that the third ball I hit seemed like it could go all around the world. I actually turned around to see if I could see it coming to where I was after it circled the world. So it is today. I'm looking to see the fulfillment of this scripture. Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Ecclesiastes 11:1. And it goes on into further description and so on. But that was reminding me, or that is what I was reminded of when I realized how, really, it's been ever since 2010 that there has been advancement. Because in 2010 is when Doug first started to have, something that could resemble a solid group of people coming around believing his message and supporting it, and then that started to build, and it's, started now to start going all around the world. Of course, with very humble beginnings. And sure, it's still not noticed, but it's really, this came to mind, and how we have so much to rejoice over, because where we are as a movement right now is a place of so much potential and so much promise. I mean, if you compare this to many other points in the history of the movement, I mean, compare this to 1955, in the end of February, let's say. Victor Hodoff had died, and there was confusion. What do we do? This is before Ben Roden wrote his letters and proclaimed anything. Or how about even after the death of Ben Roden? It was a sad time. Sure, Lois was there and already on the scene and all of that, but there was confusion because George was making a point to oppose the Holy Spirit message through his mother and so on. And okay, how about moving forward to 1984? Things are falling apart in the branch movement. Publishing house had been burned down, and George is selling a whole bunch of branch material, or property is the better way to put it, not lands necessarily, but just possessions, and just selling a whole bunch of things without permission or consent from his mother. And at that time, Vernon took he started his setup in Palestine, Texas, and Lois was having very few people actually supporting her. Okay, how about 1987? Lois had died. Everything is just going really bad. Shootout between Vernon Howell and George Roden, and the New Mount Carmel Center property was basically being desecrated, and then Vernon takes over New Mount Carmel Center, and things were just going down. Okay, 1993, 1994, branch name, whole bunch of bad news for the branch at that time. Branch name being blackened before the eyes of the world. I mean, things have been really, really bad for this movement at many times in the past. And ever since 2010, there's been advancement. And it hasn't stopped. It's continued on. And sure, there's tests and trials in life and all of that. But as we've talked about before, this message is getting more exposure now than it has had since, 1983. And there's just a lot happening, Our Heavenly Family has been showing us so much and been calling people to the truth, and the harvest is ripe. There are many saying, Yahweh, lift up the light of your countenance over us. Psalm 4. We live in such a promising time. So this is one aspect that has just been on my mind, and it's, I really do want you guys to be encouraged, because in reality we live in a very encouraging time and are in a good position as a movement. It's a good time for this message to go forward. And another thing that I want to mention that's a counsel for everyone and also something to be an encouragement, and that is to identify yourself according to truth. Let truth be the thing which defines who you are. And this will save you from falling to many temptations. A lot of temptations that come someone's way is really just portraying them as not being on the side of truth, and then they fall for it and then don't end up on the side of truth. So I want to specify what I'm talking about a little bit more. First, I'll give some, more doctrinal type examples. Okay, so let's say someone, they define themselves, they have a sense of self-identity as being a Seventh-day Adventist, and they're part of the church, and everything is going well. And then you find out that, there's some problems with the mainstream version of things and the message and so on, and you realize that some things have changed, and so you have a bit of identity crisis. Oh no, what do I do? Or the branch message comes your way and you recognize the truth, but you don't want to be a branch Davidian. You want to be, whatever it may be. Okay, that's identity getting in the way, because truth isn't the identifying factor. It's something else. Another thing, a bit more practical for our purposes. Okay, so, we've had to study some big issues and question things and investigate things. And, we've talked about the existence of our Heavenly Family and the resurrection of Jesus and things like the virgin birth and the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Some of these things are core beliefs for people. And just questioning them can raise a lot of doubt and suspicion and dissatisfaction, and people don't like having to go through that experience. But why? What if we were to find out that Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, or if we were to find out even that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or that our Heavenly Family doesn't exist, or something like that? If we were to find out stuff like that, and it just absolutely crushes us and we feel so awful, all that would reveal is that we prize those ideas higher than the truth. So what we have to do is come to recognize, wait, we don't want ideas or a particular thing here or a particular thing there to characterize who I am. I want the truth to characterize who I am. That's what we have to do. The truth must characterize us, and that way we can receive correction, and we will be happy to be corrected on something. If we're wrong on something, it doesn't matter, because we're not identifying ourselves by our former or current beliefs. We identify ourselves by truth, and that's it. Now, to bring this even a little closer to home, let's say you have a personal tendency that is really, really bad, and you haven't realized how bad it is. Let's say there's something that you do, let's say it's how you talk to your spouse, and you've just formed a habit of talking to them really negatively and hurting their feelings a lot without even realizing it, but you're always speaking in a derogatory way to your spouse, let's say, and you just form the habit and you don't even realize it. Okay, well, let's say you find that out. Well, what are you going to do? Well, what the devil would want you to do is either to deny it altogether, or to not care, or to become so bothered by it that you fall into utmost discouragement and despair and just give up on life. Well, here's the thing. Any of those reactions would be a lack of love for truth. If you love the truth, yes, you will have despair and remorse over what you have done and seek to remedy the situation, but you won't have despair about your own standing, in a sense, at that moment. Sure, you will despair over what you have done and who you were in what you were doing, but if you love truth, and if truth is what identifies you, then you will, of course, have remorse, seek to remedy it, but you won't be driven to despair and discouragement, because you will say, I have learned something about myself. You'll say, you'll be grateful for the fact that you were corrected, and you will now, in realizing that truth, move forward in that truth. So you will receive the correction well. I mean, one could give countless examples in order to illustrate this principle, but it can be a huge help when you're being tempted to be discouraged, because often people define themselves by what they have done, not by whatever the truth is. And if you define yourself by what you have done, what your tendencies have been, you may end up going to utmost remorse and discouragement by thinking, oh, I'm like, who am I? I'm an adulterer, or, oh, I'm a thief, or I'm a liar. Like, if you have seen your tendencies and the things that you have done, and let's say one of your primary sins has been lying. Well, look, if you allow your sin to define you and go into despair and discouragement and, oh, I'm a liar, or let's say you have been a violent person, and even, someone who has killed someone, oh, well, I'm a murderer, and you allow that to consume you, or whatever it may be. You may define yourself by your sin, but if you define yourself by your sin, you are going to be discouraged and give up. If you define yourself by your circumstances, you may be discouraged and give up. There are many ways and many things that you could look at in your life and use those things to define yourself. And if you do it by anything other than truth, you'll end up in discouragement and you won't have success. But if you allow the truth to be the thing that defines you, well, if you must be corrected, you will be rejoicing in that correction, even if it's difficult, and even if you have remorse over something that you have done or whatever it may be, and may see the weightiness of it and need to remedy it. But you will, at the same time, be encouraged by the correction. And so the appeal to you guys is to let truth be the thing that defines you and to be encouraged in all things. So,
Amen.
I know Ed, and you mentioning the thing here about Judas Maccabeus wasn't necessarily, a request for a pep talk or anything. And this isn't necessarily designed to be a pep talk, but in you mentioning, what Judas Maccabeus was doing there, it just, it brings to mind the need for encouragement. And I know that right now the enemy is seeking to discourage people, and all of these elements are things that if you keep them in your minds, you can be saved from so much. So anyway, any comments or questions?
I'm planning on this movement going all the way soon. Myself, and I'm nobody, but and I hope it don't sound like I'm bragging, but when I went to junior college, our class, Boeing come down hard, the whole class, which was very unusual. When I was in the Army, our sergeant says we were his best class. Anyway, a bunch of things like that have happened. That even though I've been real slow, I flunked the third grade. But I feel like God is guiding me and all of us, to do things. He's got work to be done, and I think part of our shyness with talking is just the fact we're kind of overwhelmed. We're talking to a prophet. We didn't realize it maybe when we first came into the message, but we don't know what to do with that. My friend moved today. Anyway, Sister Wisdom is working with him. He won't let me talk at all, but today he says, "You really believe that guy is a prophet?" I said, "Yes." So he's never said nothing like that before in all of our, mostly he's just telling people, "That guy's a Davidian, don't listen to him." But anyway, praise the Lord. I'm enjoying being a part of this movement. Anyway, it's just little things in our life, I think, kind of stirs us to which direction to go, and I want to be a part of this movement. And even though I've made lots of mistakes and choices and stuff, but I have great hopes that things are going to really get exciting with us soon.
Amen.
Not only does the Bible say so, we can point ourselves out in the scriptures, Anyway, I hope I made some kind of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say amen to Leroy, and just that on the whole making mistakes in our life, we've all done that. Our whole life has been nothing but folly because we're not searching for truth. We're just looking at the world and trying to do what everyone else is doing, and doing what we were taught we're supposed to do or whatever without really any true basis. So, unless we're searching for truth, which we're all just now doing for the first time in our lives, we're all a bunch of mistake makers.
Amen.
True.
Even if we learn that we find out the Bible is not, nowhere was it commanded for anybody to put together a bunch of books and say you can't read any other ones. That's a shocker for some people, boy. When you speak against the Bible, they're right on top of you.
Yeah, or at least it comes across as speaking against the Bible, but I think it's important to emphasize, hey, look, we're not saying anything against any of these books in particular or anything like that, but, it is a test issue for sure.
I was thinking a good question would be to say, well, where does it tell anybody to put these books together and say you can't read all these other ones? Put that burden on them.
Yeah, in other words, the Bible doesn't know of itself. There's no Bible mentioned in the Bible. I was just noticing the time here. It's we've been on for about an hour and 10 minutes, and of course, as you guys know, our calling card lasts for an hour and a half. So we read the first paragraph here in chapter 7, and so I don't know if you guys are wanting to, like, if there are any more comments on the paragraph, or if you guys want to move on to the next paragraph and, kind of read it and discuss it during these next 20 minutes or maybe 15 minutes. Or if you guys would rather not move on to the next part until tomorrow night and then, bring it to an end within the next 20 minutes tonight. What are your guys' thoughts?
I just got here, so I'd like to read a little bit. I kind of forgot what time, wasn't looking at the time quick, so I come in about 20 minutes late, or maybe more.
Well, I'm about to fall asleep here. I'm pretty tired. I don't want to miss anything, to be honest. So, but whatever the majority wants, I suppose.
Amen with that here too.
Anyone else?
I'm good either way. I mean, maybe we could, I can read the next paragraph real quick, and then we can kind of close off from that and have discussion. We can all read it on ourselves again, and then maybe open tomorrow's call with discussion, something like that.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. And plus, some paragraphs require more discussion or less discussion. So in reading the next, I think we'll be able to see kind of where that lies. So sure, if you'd like to read the next paragraph, we'd be good with that.
Okay, paragraph 2. When King Antiochus heard of these things, he was very angry at what had happened. So he got together all his own army with many mercenaries whom he had hired from the islands, and took them with him, and prepared to break into Judea about the beginning of the spring. But when upon his mustering his soldiers, he perceived that his treasures were deficient, and that there was a want of money in them. For all the taxes were not paid by reason of the seditions that had been among the nations, he having been so magnanimous and so liberal that what he had was not sufficient for him. He therefore resolved first to go to Persia and collect the taxes of that country. Hereupon he left one whose name was Lysias, who was in great repute with the governor of the kingdom, as far as the bounds of Egypt and the lower Asia, and reaching from the river Euphrates, and committed to him a certain part of his forces and of his elephants, and charged him to bring up his son Antiochus with all possible care until he came back, and that he should conquer Judea and take its inhabitants for slaves, and utterly destroy Jerusalem and abolish the whole nation. And when King Antiochus had given these things in charge to Lysias, he went into Persia, and in the 147th year he passed over Euphrates and went to the superior provinces.
Okay, yeah, so this is moving on into the year 165 BC. And, it looks like the basic thing is, once again, an attempt to exterminate the Jewish people, and Antiochus giving the command to Lysias or Lysias, or however his name is to be pronounced, giving the command to, looks like he wants him to raise his son, who is also named Antiochus, and also to go against Jerusalem and utterly destroy it and bring an end to the nation. Okay, so I don't know how much discussion is required on that paragraph. It seems to be stating just the circumstances. But I think we should bring the meeting to an end within these next 10 minutes. So if you guys prefer to discuss this tomorrow night, that's perfectly fine. And so I just want to find out if there are any last comments before we close off. Okay. So would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
Wish we had a way to raise our hand or show we're willing instead of talking and then maybe taking chance of talking over the top of somebody else. There must be a way. Anyway, I will with your Heavenly Family. We thank you for your daughter here on earth with us that is teaching us, preparing us to do a work you've been trying to get done for a long time. Help us not to let you down. Thank you that you're working with my friend. And thank you that we have a connection with you. Please give us everything we need. We give you our heart and our will and our mind. To do your will. In Jesus' new name, the branch, we pray and thank you. Amen.
Amen.
Ta-da.
Have a good night, everyone. Love you all very much.
Good night.
Ta-da.